Standing now, perhaps a few hundred people who seem pretty well committed to making sure that doesn't happen. David?
All right, Garrett, keep tabs on this for us, if you would. Garrett Haake, who is standing right outside the White House, right outside the old executive office building, near to where that protest took place. Again, it is wrapped up here in these last few minutes. Those couple dozen protesters, couple dozen white supremacists, as Garrett says, now have to make their way back to Northern Virginia, leaving the Washington, D.C. area. We're going to continue to monitor what's going on there in downtown D.C. I want to turn to my panel now, to DeRay McKesson. He's a Black Lives Matter activist and the author of the forthcoming book, On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope. Christina Greer joins us as well. She's a Fordham University Associate Professor of Political Science and an NYU McSilver Institute Fellow. Michael Singleton is a Republican political consultant, and Dean Obadala is a Daily Beast, a columnist who recently won his libel lawsuit against an alt-right website. Dean, let me turn to you. You're right next to me here in New York City. I just want to get your perspective on what's happened here today. As Garrett was talking about just a moment ago, it was unclear how many people were going to show up. You look at the application that this white nationalist group put forward to the Park Service. They said they expected 400 people to come. We saw a fraction of that today in Washington, D.C.
It's great you did not see a massive turnout of the white nationalists, white supremacists. I wish that would indicate that they were receding in this country and they were not emboldened by Donald Trump. But that's not the reality. This is a microcosm, a little incident. And the rain scared their superior race away. I wish it was that simple to get rid of racism, but it's not. You know, we have a president where, as you mentioned to me, white supremacy has been very personal. I wrote an article last year for the Daily Beast denouncing white supremacists and calling out Donald Trump to use the term white supremacist terrorism. This was before Charlottesville. We had 2 other white supremacist terrorist attacks. The result was the Daily Stormer, the neo-Nazi website, fabricated tweets saying I was involved with terrorism because I'm Muslim, and said to their supporters, come get me. So I got death threats from them and had to sue them. Yeah. So this is very real. They're not, a handful of people might be there, but believe me, their numbers are bigger. And sadly, 85% of Republicans support Donald Trump, despite the fact we see objectively him supporting racism.
DeRay McKesson, let me turn to you as we're looking at pictures here outside the Renwick Gallery in Northwest D.C. Again, right across the street from the old executive office building. This is where a number of Trump administration offices are. We are just talking about footsteps away from the White House itself. Help us understand what we're seeing here, if you could, DeRay, and give us your read on the size, the might of this counter-protest that we saw in Washington, D.C. today.
Yeah, we always think about protests as the idea of telling the truth in public. So it's important that people out there are telling the truth about the history of racism and what the country should be. What the counter-protesters know today is that there's no non-racist version of white nationalism. So when people talk about white nationalism as if it's like a valid policy position, we know that that is a wild statement, that what they're trying to do is normalize white nationalism to provide cover for this part of the base of the party, and that just can't be okay. I think what you see is that it's tense right now in so many ways, that the police have a history of managing these with mixed response. I do think in D.C. it has been better than some other places. I'm hopeful that it'll be a simple day. You know, it started raining, so you see a lot of the energy even dissipating at this moment. But again, we can't feed into normalizing white nationalism as anything other than a racist stance, and I think you see the counter-protesters out to make that really clear for people.
Yeah, Christina Greer, I'll turn to you now on that point. I mean, you just look at what this group is calling this protest, Unite the Right. There's an effort there just in naming this to try to normalize what's happening here. Speak to that, if you would, just the effort here to normalize this extremist hate that we saw in Washington, D.C. today.
Right, indeed. I mean, we even see this in, with NPR and the New York Times constantly trying to set up a false equivalency between white supremacist groups and Black Lives Matter.
And I'll interrupt to say what you're referring to there is I know that NPR interviewed the organizer of this rally on its air earlier this week, received a lot of criticism for that. A lot of folks think they either shouldn't have done that or they should have pushed back a little harder against the organizer of this group.
Right, and there's nothing wrong with necessarily interviewing organizers of these groups, but you need to make sure that these are not the white equivalent of Black Lives Matter leaders. You need to make sure that these are people who are called out as white supremacists who have a specific vision of what they want this country to look like and who they want in and outside of this country. So I do think that we need to be a lot more vigilant in how we talk about these groups. These are groups that are built on hate. These are groups that are marching through the streets of America carrying Confederate flags and Nazi paraphernalia. They're talking about Jewish Americans. They're talking about Black Americans. They're talking about all immigrants. And they have no place in our discourse. Unfortunately, the media, and that goes for left-wing media and right-wing media and everyone else who tries to be neutral, has not done enough to make sure that these groups are not normalized. These people are in our country. They have always been in our country. Many of them have been the founders of our country, but we cannot accept them anymore in our nation. And it's unfortunate that we have a president who is essentially tweeting his feelings that they have a right to be here, and say very hateful things and do very hateful things to the vast majority of Americans.
Michael Singleton, I want to get your read on that. The president did not come out and deliver a statement on the occasion of this anniversary. He didn't release a written statement. There was a tweet of fewer than 280 characters in which he nodded to this anniversary. He said that he rejected racism of all kinds. Peace to all Americans, I believe, is how he closed that tweet. You're a Republican political strategist. How are you processing that, the reaction that we've seen here from the President of the United States?
Well, look, David, I mean, at this point, I would think it would be naive for anyone to have the expectation that the president is going to speak out forcefully against these things. For the Republican Party, it means trouble. I mean, the fact of the matter is the country is becoming more diverse. You have one of the major political parties in this country that has shown an inability and not even a willingness to want to target and mobilize and properly address some of the critiques, legitimate critiques of those communities. And so I don't think this is a good thing for the president, the party, or the country. But as it relates specifically to these individuals, I think that the fight for freedom, for equality, for justice, etc., goes beyond just protesting. And if I could just really quickly,
Sure.
England, who runs the Daily Stormer website, which is like the premier white supremacist website, wrote a column today, and I read it. And he wrote in his column, and I quote, "While many people do support whites maintaining a white society in America, no one supports neo-Nazi street fighting." He continued, "Armband and neo-Nazism is never going to be that popular in America." And throughout that column, he talks about how they have to change their focus. And so my concern is infiltrating law enforcement, putting those individuals in our school systems, those individuals running for public office that we don't even know what their actual beliefs are. And so I think being diligent, has to go beyond protesting. We have to also make sure that the right people are running for public office, are becoming law enforcement, are educating our kids so that we can combat this in more than one measure.
Dean, on that note, there is normalizing of this ideology, this twisted ideology. I think what Michael's talking about there as well is just this group cohering. You look at who showed up here. David Duke was expected to be there. I don't know if, in fact, he was. He was on the application by this group to the National Park Service. What's your sense of the cohesiveness of this right wing, this hate movement?
I don't know how cohesive they are. I can tell you this. Michael just mentioned Andrew England from the Daily Stormer, the man I sued, the man who fabricated tweets saying that I committed a terrorist attack. A man that wrote articles that Dylan Roof read and was radicalized to kill 9 African Americans. A man who wrote articles that James Jackson came from Baltimore to New York last year to kill black people, to start a race war. The Daily Stormer, to me, I don't care what games Andrew England's playing. He's a Nazi. He's a terrorist. We have a president who will use the terms radical Islam all day, but will not use the terms white supremacist terrorism. We have a president who will demonize black people by name. Maxine Waters, people in the media, LeBron James. He will not talk about David Duke by name. He will not talk about the white supremacist organization and their leaders by name. We need leadership, and we're getting a president, objectively, who's emboldening these white supremacists. So what they all believe internally, I have no idea. But I know their vision of America does not include me, does not include anyone on this panel, does not include Jews, blacks, Muslims, or immigrants. And Donald Trump, with terms like chain migration and low IQ, which I just wrote about last week, comes from white supremacist science, racism, where that's where they get the term low IQ from, and chain migration was brought to life by the white supremacists. Your president's gone beyond words into policy, and with one voice in this country, including good Republicans, we must denounce it.
Let me go back here to Garrett Haake, who is standing with this group here outside the White House, right by the old executive office building, nearby to where this protest took place. A few moments ago, we saw some folks firing off Roman candles, as Garrett said. We saw some small scuffles with law enforcement. Garrett, it looks pretty static to me right now. It looks like there's a bit of a détente here, but I assume this group of a couple dozen white nationalists has not yet made its way out of that area, out of Lafayette Plaza, Pennsylvania Avenue, in front of the White House, to the Metro station.
Well, Well, David, the bottom line is we don't actually know that at this point, and that this whole day might have a fittingly underwhelming end for what was an underwhelming rally by these white nationalists in the first place. We were hearing conflicting reports that small group, again, only about 24 of them, might have been able to get out of this park complex through one of the other entrances and either making their way back to the train station or back directly to Virginia. The pictures you're looking at now, these are Antifa protesters who, as soon as the police took their position here to prepare to open this gate, surged into the way here to make sure that was not going to be an easy task. They had barricades of bamboo and chicken wire, signage, flagpoles that you'll note, and a general attitude that they don't like to be filmed, talked about, looked at, or discussed while they're doing what they're doing. They prevented us from moving through the area, too, while we were trying to get a little picture here and seeing what was going on with these folks trying to leave. But again, as the rain falls here, David, we just don't know, I admit, the location of those 24 or so protest or rally goers who were originally out here. We know now only that the counter-protest group remains, clearly spoiling for some kind of confrontation, and apparently not particularly concerned about who that's with, whether it's the white nationalist groups or whether it's the police. But again, this may sort of sputter out here on the back end, as it does appear, at least anecdotally, it looks like we may be done with this rally altogether. David?
Garrett Hake, my colleague there in Washington, D.C., and just to paint a picture here, Lafayette Plaza is square, shaped about 2 blocks wide, maybe 1 block tall. Garrett is standing with those protesters there at the southwestern corner of that park. As Garrett was indicating, perhaps those protesters, those white nationalist protesters, could have left from any of the other corners. Anybody who's been to D.C. recently knows that part of Pennsylvania Avenue is not one that cars customarily go on. It's an area that's closed off to public traffic. Let me turn again to DeRay McKesson, if I could. You have been at protests where we've seen Antifa protesters in concert with Black Lives Matter and other groups. You're looking at the quantity of folks who have turned out today in the thousands to counter-protest, to protest against the white supremacists that we're seeing, and one wonders, DeRay, how you carry this message going forward. There's the message of the show of force. There are real policy changes that need to happen. You want what's being shown here today to carry on here in the days and weeks and months to come. Talk, if you would, just about the role of Antifa in concert with or in complement to other protest groups.
Yeah, so I don't have much to say besides, I won't speculate about what people might do if they haven't indicated that is certainly going to happen. So you look at, I heard the other anchor talk about people are itching for a fight and things like that. And the reality is that the situation is tense. I've been to protests all across the country, and they're tense everywhere. It's probably tense right now out there. And remember that none of the protesters brought the tension. They're responding to tension. So I just want to put that out there. The second is, I don't even know how these people got a permit. Is that we know that when we think about free speech, speech that incites violence actually isn't covered under the free speech clause. And in a year ago, this same sort of group of people incited violence that resulted in the death of one person. And that white nationalism, the KKK, neo-Nazis, have inspired and incited violence throughout this country's history, and the history of lynching isn't too far removed. And the last point that you asked about with regard to the changes is that we know that the outcomes indicate that racial disparities are at an all-time high. So you think about, what does it mean that in New York City, 90% of the arrests for marijuana are black and brown people? That is definitely a function of race. 1 in 11 people killed, 1 in 11 homicides in California is committed by an officer. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in this country is actually killed by a police officer. That there are so many disparities. We arrest more people for weed than all violent crimes combined. That all of these things function along the line of race. And what rallies like today aim to do is to normalize and to allow to enter into the public conversation, into the civic sphere, white nationalism as a legitimate policy point, and we can't let that happen. We know that the disparities are real, so we fight the disparities. So it's not just in the street that we fight, but we come to the street so that we can make people know at home that we will not be silent in the face of this hate.
DeRay McKesson, Black Lives Matter activist, author of the forthcoming book On the Other Side of Freedom, along with Christina Greer-Fordham, Shermichael Singleton, a Republican political consultant, and Dean Abdallah of the Daily Beast. We're going to continue to monitor what's going on outside of the White House in Washington, D.C. at this very moment. Again, that protest organized by white supremacists has ended. It appears law enforcement in Washington, D.C. trying to get them to the metro station, to get them out of Washington, D.C. Our coverage on MSNBC continues.
There's
There's a locally owned Ace in over 5,000 neighborhoods. That's twice as many helpful hardware locations as any of the warehouse stores. But we're not about numbers. We're about helping neighbors, because each of our stores is a part of your community. 5,000's a lot, but it's nowhere close to the number of ways we can help you.
Join us for the 5,000 store celebration sale. Don't miss the daily deals and